Welcome to the Financial Security for All Community of Practice webinar. These webinars, this monthly webinar series is sponsored by the Financial Security for All Community of Practice. It's a webinar to help financial educators learn more and find resources. It's produced by the University of Arkansas System Division of Agriculture Cooperative Extension Service, and we are pleased today to bring you another great topic. You may recognize a couple of our presenters from a previous webinar. We're delighted to have them back and with a new topic. So today's title is Connecting Culture and Financial Resources, and we're going to be learning about ways we can better teach financial education through Latino lens, including Mexican American and American Indian cultural lens. We have with us today from University of Minnesota, Antonio Albaraz. He's an extension educator and extension professor in the Center for Family Development. He is passionate about his work, helping individuals and families with well-being through financial education, financial capability, housing, school success in English and Spanish language. He works with diverse populations, and he is co-chair and the co-founder of the Extension Latino Community of Practice there at his university. Jennifer Garbo is extension educator and associate extension professor in the University of Minnesota Extension Center for Family Development. She's been in leadership with tribal communities and financial capability for a long time. She's works with her extensions, American Indian Community of Practice. And then Becky Hagen-Jokela, you'll recognize as a longtime member of the Financial Security for All community, if you've been in any of our meetings. She's also an accredited financial counselor and has a certification in family life educator, teaching license in family and consumer sciences, and reading certification from AA FCS. And she co-leads a cultural study group to expand financial education. So please join me in welcoming our presenters for today.
Alba Miraz, and I'm with University of Minnesota and as an extension educator, and I'm located in the extension regional office in Mankato, Minnesota. I have over 20 years in extension in the nonprofit sector, working with families in Minnesota.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer Garbo, and I'm an extension educator in the Center for Family Development in Family Resiliency at the University of Minnesota. And I have been with extension for about 13 years, and I have about 20 years of experience working with American Indian families and communities.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Becky Hagen-Jokela, and my regional office is in Kay, Minnesota, and I'm an extension educator in family resiliency. And I just have to say that it's amazing how fast the years go. As August 1, I have 27 years with extension, and proud to say that we've been working together, our team here, the cultural team, for a number of years that you'll hear more about later. So welcome.
This presentation is related to connecting culture and financial resources. And one of the goals of this presentation is to help the facilitator to have a better understanding about people's situations, their communication styles, and to develop skills to work with people from diverse cultures. Regarding the learning objectives for today's presentation, one objective for this presentation is to view some of the cultural elements and people's experiences and related to access and use resources, especially financial resources. Recognize how to to help people we serve to expand financial resources in a cultural frame. Another objective is to use strategies to try to understand how a family uses financial resources, including other community resources. Finally, to recognize learning preferences and communication styles.
So just a brief history of the culture and money lesson. So it's the first lesson from a financial literacy curriculum that we have at the University of Minnesota called DollarWorks 2. Many of you may be familiar with it. It's existed for a long time. It's considered our seminal financial education curriculum. And it is intended for our Train the Trainer workshops. So DollarWorks 2, just really briefly, is a comprehensive personal financial education program. It includes the knowledge, tools, and strategies for teaching others about personal finances. And it is available in English and Spanish, and you can go to extension.umn.edu to find out more about DollarWorks 2, as well as ordering curriculum or receiving training. So, you know, when we think about how our society is changing and related to populations that we are working with, we understand that historically financial capability was and oftentimes is still developed by white professionals for white families. But we at the University of Minnesota Extension have been working for over a decade to really change this narrative in response to our changing demographics within our communities, within our state, within our nation. And, you know, we are really trying to be responsive and responding to the inclusion of new cultural understandings and how families of color and Indigenous families manage and think about their resources. And so with that, we have worked to revise and, well, rewrite first and revise lesson 1 on culture and money.
And Jennifer mentioned that continuous updating, and we did go through with Unit 1 on culture and add different activities throughout to get people to really take time to think about understanding those that they work with. And one activity is the life experience activity, and that is to identify financial opportunities and challenges. And I'd just like to have you take a moment and think of some of the decisions that you made based upon where you happen to be in your life. For example, the birth of a new baby, addition to the family, perhaps a new vehicle of some sort that you had to think of your resources and make that big decision how you would go forth with that. And then Antonio?
Yeah, we have and for many families, there is a interesting and important event, and this is quinceañera, especially for Latino families. Quinceañera, as you know, is when the adolescent girl becomes a young woman, and this is a traditional event. As I mentioned, for Latino families, it's very important, but at the same time, it's expensive. It's expensive, very expensive, many times. Talking about housing, we have a little house there. Basically, having a house or having a home is like in the American dream. In many cultures, including the Latino culture, having a home is one of the main family or financial goals.
Yes, and the picture up in the left-hand corner, it looks like a grandma and a grandson. Just want to talk briefly about with American Indian families, It's very common for grandma to be raising her grandchildren. And there are a variety of reasons for this. The American Indian culture is considered more of a collectivism culture versus individualism, and I'll talk a bit more about that as our presentation goes on. But there's really a strong sense of obligation and caring for one another, and so it is quite common for grandmothers to be raising their grandchildren. And when we think about that in terms of financial capability and what that means for resource management within the household, there are a lot of financial opportunities, but there are also a lot of financial challenges that can arise with that, as there's an influx within the household of family members and perhaps even community members coming in to stay for a period of time and then maybe leaving. Oftentimes, grandma is the person who is the head of household and trying to put all of the financial pieces together to make it work for the family.
And here is the worksheet that was added. And as you can see, there's kind of a maze and what we might go through, maybe typically or not, but it's where their life experiences that can be identified for the individual, where they would think of them, those financial opportunities and challenges. And Antonio is going to share a little bit more about this.
Thank you, Becky. This activity is with the purpose to reflect about how the use of resources is influenced in different life stage. Even this figure provides a sequence to place the different chronological events for this activity. We selected this figure in this handout because for some cultures it represents the sun, and the sun represents a divine power, the light and the energy. And for instance, the importance of this in the growth of crops. And then for many people from different cultures, they will be identified with this figure, even in addition to representing the light and the energy. This figure represent for many cultures the four cardinal directions. I mean, the north, the south, the west, and the east.
There are different types of resources that we think are really important to consider when you're helping an individual or a family or even a community understand resource management. And so human, non-human, and time resources are the three types of resources that I want to talk briefly about. So oftentimes when we are in financial management, financial education, financial capability, we as educators or service providers really focus on the monetary. And we often, it's easy to overlook all of the other really important resources that are contributing to the well-being of the family unit. For example, some human resources would be the ability to work with others. So that cooperation, that collaboration, the decision-making process, the communication with one another is really critical, even if you're talking just about money as a resource. Our health is also a human resource to consider. We don't often think about that until perhaps we have some health challenges, and then we really understand how critical it is for ourselves and for our family members and our community to be healthy and to be able to contribute to the overall well-being of our family. Creativity and attitudes, the ability to learn, intellectual resources, these are all really, really important resources to consider when we're sitting down and whether we are having a one-on-one session with an individual to help them figure out a resource management plan for themselves or their family, or whether we're teaching a class on family resource management. Of course, non-human resources are resources that we as service providers and professionals often think about and focus on, and rightfully so. We have money, we have housing, food, and then there are oftentimes services, ancillary services that can help support the well-being of a family overall, such as schools, parks, libraries, law enforcement, those kinds of things. For many of us who are dealing with our families and communities who are in crisis right now because of our epidemic, money, housing, and food, and now, of course, with the school year coming up, these are really important things to consider and to work with our families on. So time resources is something that isn't often talked about, and I think is unique in our lesson. So for example, we all have the same amount of time within a day. We all have 24 hours, but the perception of time for different cultures, for communities of color or for Indigenous communities can be different. And it's really important to think about that as you're working with these families or considering developing new tools or resources for them. So for example, for American Indian people, we not only considered the perception of a full cycle of a day, but seasonal cycles as well. And within those seasonal cycles, the 4 seasons, there were different events and activities and hunting and gathering and different things that happened during the different seasons that contributed to the overall well-being of the individual families, but collectively as a group of people. And those things still really hold true today. For example, right now in northern Minnesota, it's wild rice harvesting time. And so many of our community members and my family and my friends are out right now in their canoes harvesting wild rice. And they will use that rice to use for their own personal use, but they will also use that to sell, to supplement a portion of their incomes, to give to other family and friends and community members as well. And so these are all really important resources to consider when we think about the overall resource management within families.
And it's important to take a look at what factors might influence one's decision making about the resources. And of course, every individual has their own values and their life experiences, even generational influences from their family members, etc. But if we take a look at culture and environment, you can see a couple of pictures there, and I love the one from American Indian powwow, beautiful attire that with a lot of pride in creating and that's shared. And of course, we sometimes think of traditional foods that might be chosen within individuals, families, and even generational celebrations as an example. So those experiences that we all have growing up might influence our choices in what we make as far as resource usage. Also to consider would be the family systems. There are many different kinds of families, like we're aware of, the extended, nuclear, single parent families, foster, adopted, same-sex parenting, children that are a part of a family from various means. So it's who is important to that family network. So the type of family can vary, and they're writing their own histories as they go through time. So it's important to think about what makes up part of this, and it's so individual, and certainly our values are a big factor in this.
Because we are talking about culture, we're trying to find what's behind this word. In this definition, we can see how a group of people see and understand others. We can also see some of the cultural elements such as language, norms, customs, morals, beliefs, and conventions. Convention is just something generally done or believed. That's a definition, very short definition about what is convention. For instance, shaking hands, hospitality will I would say is they are convention in some with many cultures or many ethnic groups, because we can find many definitions about culture. We have here one more, and this definition brings other perspective about what culture is. And this definition has relevant, important, especially when I'm working with diverse groups, because they feel identified with these elements that conform this concept of culture. I will say this definition includes not just the elements from what we call culture. This narrative shows, or this definition shows, the biological purpose of people to live, to survive, and to adapt to its environment. And that's important because for this reason, it's no strange that Latinos and other ethnic groups use a strong family support to cope with financial issues or just to access some community resources.
Before I talk about this, though, I do want to note that it isn't oftentimes completely one or the other. In fact, Becky and I did a series of interviews some time ago with American Indian head of households, and we did find that there was a lot of blending between these two, between individualism and collectivism structures. However, when we think about cultures of racially and ethnically different cultural groups, there are some notable differences. And as service providers and educators, it is important to know some of those differences. So an individualism structure is probably the most common, the most mainstream in what many of us are accustomed to working with. Many of our tools and resources around financial capability are designed by people who have experienced an individualism structure, and they are designed for families who are more within that camp of the individualism structure. And so some of the hallmarks of this individualism might be a family unit as a mom and a dad and children. And one of the goals for parents is to raise the children to become self-sufficient. So young into adulthood, they are working to help them to take care of themselves, perhaps with little support from their parents as they enter into college or enter into the workforce, but as they leave home. In contrast, a collectivism structure is a family unit that could be a mom, a dad, it could be grandparents, it could be aunts, uncles, cousins, children, and even non-blood related people within the community that have been taken in and considered as family. And so it's much more of kind of a holistic way of managing resources within one's home and caring for others, having that sense of responsibility and obligation toward the well-being of others that extend beyond just perhaps mom and dad and children. I do think that with our current economic situation over the last number of years, we're seeing a lot of multi-generational households. that were historically or traditionally more of within the individualism structure. And that has a lot to do with economic stressors and those kinds of things. And so, oftentimes there is a blending between these two, but typically that individualism is associated with more of a mainstream or a white family structure, whereas collectivism is really associated with families of color or indigenous families.
One of my colleagues talked about the different kinds of resources and families, or the family can influence the use of resources too. The cultural use of resources starts with the family of origin, because in the birth family, adopted family, and placement family, children spend much time and they have many cultural influences during childhood. Those influences typically are from parents and grandparents in the birth family. Adopted parents in the adopted family, and foster parents in the placement family. They are the influencers too, or they influence very much in the culture when in children. In addition, parents and grandparents in these families, even an older sibling and other adult contribute to the child growing up. Regarding the family of choice, these families, they are not necessarily blood related. It's a family not necessarily related by blood. For instance, a married couple or a couple living together. They are examples of family of choice. And why, or where is the importance or the relationship with culture? The importance of this is because they experience a sharing of cultural elements, including the different ways to use resources. Remember, they come from different families. They come with their own set of cultural values, beliefs, and other components from the culture. And then another piece of this, or one more characteristic from the family of choice, is the family of choice can change over time in many cultures. And that is important to understand this during our teaching, or if we are providing them some information to access community resources. We have also, in part of the influences in order to manage financial resources or access resources. We have we can see in urban and rural people how they can view and use resources in a different way. For example, some people from a rural area, from some Latino American countries, they may see here in the US, everything costs money, and there is not a community land, because in the country or countries of origin exists bartering, gathering from the land and making some goods themselves. For instance, in Latino immigrants, they come to the United States seeking opportunities for a better life. However, most of them, they are low income with a diverse of many different experiences to access resources in their own countries. And when they come here, many of them they are struggling to navigate the financial, the education or school, health, and other systems. In addition, many migrants don't have proper documentation. And then that makes worse the situation for many families to reach some of the community resources. Finally, the culture determines how the resources are viewed and used for the individuals and the families.
Well, there are different types of poverty that families experience, and I'm going to talk about one type, which is generational poverty. I won't read through these, but you can see that there are a number of examples here. In thinking about generational poverty, it is noted that it occurs within families where there are at least two generations who have been born into poverty. And in economics, the cycle of poverty is a set of factors or events by which poverty, once started, is likely to continue unless there is outside intervention. Families trapped in the cycle of poverty have either limited or no resources. There are many disadvantages that collectively work in a circular process, making it virtually impossible for individuals to break the cycle. This occurs when poor people do not have the resources necessary to get out of poverty, such as financial capital, education, or connections. In other words, impoverished individuals do not have the access to economic and social resources as a result of their poverty. This lack may increase their poverty, and it could mean that these folks remain poor and impoverished throughout their lives. And I looked at many different definitions of poverty, and I chose one that was actually on Wikipedia because I thought it really encompassed a lot of different key pieces, particularly the societal factors and how that contributes to generational poverty. So US statistics and the official measures of poverty are considered by most that they're becoming outdated and inaccurate. But what we do know as educators and service providers is that poverty is increasing. The different types of poverty is increasing. Generational poverty is becoming more difficult to cycle out of after it has occurred within 2 generations of the family.
Okay, another type of poverty is what is referred to as situational poverty. And it could be situations then that could be expected somewhat or even unexpected. And we certainly know in current times, going through the pandemic, there are many situations that perhaps individuals and families may not have considered that reflect their financial stability. But it could include job loss due to changes in the economy, health changes within oneself or family, and perhaps you hear more and more about medical bills and how it can surprise many in many respects. Looking at such occurrences as divorce and death in the family, and just meeting the needs of those mental health needs as well, and going through stressful times certainly can be a situational factor that can contribute to uneasiness, perhaps, in some respects. Even a new job or some need for additional education or skills can create perhaps expenditures in a different direction than initially thought of. For example, I spoke with someone recently who acquired a new position, but they had the need to go back to school to acquire skills that they needed. And so the cost there was a factor for them. And back, we had a slide in regard to influences, and I didn't want to forget the current economic influencing factors that we're all experiencing. We referred to the COVID, but I think we can all relate to changes within our families, our neighborhoods, our communities that affect all of us. So situational poverty, it may be long-lasting or short in response, but it does affect how one uses their resources.
In addition to generational and situational poverty, we can see we have an immigration poverty too. When I mention immigrants, they come to this country for looking for better opportunities. They are looking for opportunities for work, opportunities to improve their family well-being. Even most of them come with most of them come with few economic resources. Regarding war or economic problems, most immigrants come from places in war or escaping chronic economic problems and lack of job opportunities in their places of origin. However, not all families are in poverty, and they don't see themselves as being in poverty. There are other immigrants. For instance, we have another group of immigrants, and they come to the U.S. looking for educational opportunities. There are some barriers of communication, of course. In some countries, it's very common that immigrants show problems to communicate with others, including in the U.S., in the language spoken by the stream culture. In this particular case, we are talking about the English language. And many of them are impacted by the cultural shock in different ways too. Something interesting is families of immigrants or immigrant families, usually they do better than families in generational poverty. In many cultures, people in their relationships are the most important aspect in the oral communication. That works for many cultures. Even people uses the oral culture to learn and get information. In these cultures, people uses their senses most of the time to get information and learn. When I say the senses, is the sight. You know, they listen, they see, they observe, they talk, and it's important. Even they touch. They like to touch. When we are, for instance, when I'm teaching, and I bring some artifacts to my class, they like to touch. And touching, it looks for many, generate some questions. And saying this is a good opportunity to follow with some part of the topics, or even to identify some gap in my teaching. Another characteristic from the oral culture, people, they can jump from one topic to another very easy, very easy. That means, or they can focus on several ideas in one situation. The use of stories is very characteristic too. Stories is also a way to learn and preserve the group traditions. For instance, immigrant farmers gather during lunch or dinner time to learn about other community issues. This is the opportunity to learn, to be informed, and to share their own thoughts. People in the oral culture, they like to focus in the big picture. First, and then in the details. The people feels okay sharing feelings and emotions in almost any situation. This is one more characteristic. Uh, they they have they show just the emotions practically in any situation when they find certain conditions to express that. Jennifer?
Yes, so the use of stories in communication and decision making is something that for American Indian people historically, traditionally has always occurred. And when I talked on an earlier slide about this idea of time and this idea of a seasonal approach to thinking about time, to managing resources, storytelling for Ojibwe people, which I'm Ojibwe, and so I'm speaking of Ojibwe people, traditionally occurred during the winter season or while there was snow on the ground. And for those of you that were able to join Becky and I last month in our Legends Lessons webinar, we talked a great deal about that traditional belief to share stories and to tell stories while there's snow on the ground. And our Legends Lessons are using American Indian stories to teach youth about financial education. And so it's really important to understand how, I mean, it really comes down to when you're working with your clients, your participants, your students, to be able to relate and connect with them in a way that they're comfortable with. And as Antonio mentioned, that comfort level of sharing emotions and feelings and stories and a lot of self-disclosure is something that oftentimes occurs when you're working with communities of color or American Indian communities. And so in preparation for that, it's important to understand some of these hallmarks and to be more comfortable with relating to your participants in these ways.
And so another communication style, of course, is print. And just a couple of points about that. There tends to be less senses involved in that. It's so visual, and where you think of storytelling and more emotion perhaps shared. It is more linear in sequence. And often because it's so visual, there might be more internal reacting versus the external. So looking at thinking, perhaps that, think of being a time where you're reading and you're deep in thought as an example. Often stories are not shared initially, more focus on time and perhaps less showing of emotions and feelings, and focus more on the future and planning ahead and not at the moment, perhaps knowing there are differences for everything. And as you illustrated in the poll, combination types of communication certainly tends to be very common, where it's a blend of both. And if you think of your own family network that you're linked with, it's often interesting to see how they communicate and what is comfortable for them, as well as the audiences that you work with. And as was stated, to take a look at how can we make the learning environment comfortable and meaningful and meeting our learners where they're at.
And if I could just add one piece to this communication and the differences between print and oral, I think it's important to note that many of our resources and tools that have been developed and that we have available to us as financial educators typically have favored print culture or the linear sequence. Focusing on a future, planning ahead with goals. And you can see how a lot of education, it just fits really nicely into that bucket. However, we have worked really hard over the last 10 years or so to really consider other ways of communication and how people receive and process information. And storytelling has become a really important focus of ours in our work, and understanding that to be able to help people make the best decisions for themselves, sometimes it takes conversation and it takes communication, which is really notably different from worksheets. Although, it's important to still have those worksheets and those kinds of tools and resources available. It's also equally important to gain new understanding and insight into how communities of color and indigenous communities are making these resource decisions, so that there's a comfort level and there's an ability to reach out, to communicate, and to provide those educational tools in a way that makes sense and is most useful for these families who are really trying to piece together a lot in their lives right now, as all families are in the time we're in, to make ends meet, and to make sure that their families have financial well-being in their communities as well.
As Jennifer mentioned, expect in your sessions, in your educational sessions, people uses the print and the oral culture to learn. However, it's important to identify in which moments, under what situations, they prefer to use one or the other. And I see this very, very often in my classes. And they are the opportunities to identify some opportunities, even like Jennifer mentioned, to prepare some educational materials.
To go back to our learning objectives, and we hope
Yes.
Broad view of culture and resources, and recognized how to expand learner financial resources, and awareness of utilization of strategies to understand how family utilizes resources for financial, and again, to take a look at learning preferences and communication styles. And again, knowing your audiences and their preferences for learning.
So we have some selective references here listed, and these are available to you all as well, and some selective resources that we used. So thank you to everyone who has joined us.